Now what we're gonna do is answer some of the most commonly Googled questions about ADHD. Why is ADHD on the rise? So this is a great question. So I think ADHD is on the rise for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is because we're becoming more sensitive at picking it up. So as our sophistication and awareness of ADHD is on the rise, as teachers become aware of it, as parents become aware of it, we're catching a portion of people who used to be missed. ADHD is not simply a neuroscientific illness. It's actually a neuroscientific meets environment illness. And this is a big theory that's getting a lot of momentum in psychiatry, which is that mental illnesses don't exist in a vacuum, that they actually require a particular environment to come out. So for example, we also know that like major depressive disorder can manifest in stressful jobs, in stressful relationships. And there's one study that actually shows that the student-teacher ratio correlates with the degree of ADHD diagnosis. So if I have one teacher and 30 students, keeping all of those 30 students on task is very, very difficult. And so if there's a kid who's got an ADHD predisposition, they start to act out more because they don't get as much individualized attention as they need. So as we actually increase the number of teachers to students, students can get more individualized attention. As they get more individualized attention, their ADHD shines through a little bit less. So the second reason that ADHD is on the rise is because I actually think there's stresses in our school system. So as it becomes harder to become a teacher, who ultimately suffers? The teacher suffers. And when they suffer, all the kids with ADHD also suffer. Because if you've got a burnt out teacher, they've got a little bit less patience to redirect a child. They have a little bit less ability to sit down and sort of help that child practice focus and attention and organization. Reason number 3 why I think ADHD is on the rise is simply because of technology. So we know that there's a change in technology that is shortening our attention spans. And we can see this if we look at, generally speaking, the way that content is consumed on the internet. So if you look at like originally we had blogs, right? After blogs, we had video essays. After video essays, we had like compilations. We had Vines. Now we have TikToks. So one of the things that's starting to happen is our attention span is shrinking. And as our attention span shrinks, we sort of move a little bit societally towards ADHD. There are some concerns about things like processed foods and stuff like that. There's also some evidence that as the average age of parents rises, the amount of ADHD may be correlating with that too. So there are some epidemiologic factors. But I'd say like the 3 or 4 major reasons why ADHD is on the rise is, first of all, because we're catching it more. Secondly, because we're shortening our attention spans. And third, because we've actually got a lot of stress on our school system, which means that it's harder to accommodate neuroatypical kids. Next question is, why is ADHD more common in males? So this is a really good question. So we do know that ADHD is more common in males for sure. What maturity really is frontal lobe development. And we know that boys' frontal lobes tend to develop a little bit slower than girls. So boys tend to be a little bit more impulsive. They tend to be a little bit more wavering in terms of their attention. Sometimes they're like a little bit less conscientious, especially at early ages. And so we do know that there are some very specific gender effects in terms of how boys are. Now, there's also looser evidence that, for example, ADHD is a manifestation of dynamic attention, and that the male gender has required dynamic attention on a more evolutionary aspect. So if you think a little bit about, there's this hypothesis that isn't really correct. I mean, I think it's been somewhat debunked about hunters and farmers. And these are kind of 2 personality types or cognitive styles. And in a lot of societies, the hunters tend to be men. And if you think about what hunters need to do, they need to integrate a lot of stimuli and need to have a very dynamic attention. So there may actually be some kind of selective pressure on the male gender for having a more dynamic attention. And when you have a kid who's got a dynamic attention that was sort of like evolved to be out in the wilderness where they're tracking things and noticing footprints and noticing broken things over, like broken twigs over there, and they're sort of like on the lookout for danger, and you stick that kid in a classroom for 8 hours, their brain is not really designed for that. Why is ADHD treated with stimulants? So this is a great question. It can be kind of paradoxical. And I remember before I sort of did my psychiatry training, I was always really confused about using stimulants in kids with ADHD. So here was kind of my understanding, which is that, okay, so if you have a kid who's got ADD or ADHD, their mind is moving really, really, really fast to begin with. They're having 1,000 thoughts a second. They're also fidgety. They move their arms around a lot, hands around a lot, right? They can't sit still. And what we also know is that stimulants tend to like ramp people up, right? So when I drink caffeine in the morning, my thoughts start to move faster. My mind feels more sluggish before caffeine. We also know that, caffeine and other kinds of stimulants will also lead to things like fidgetiness and stuff like that. Like I remember being a medical student and seeing people who would use cocaine or amphetamine, and they'd be like picking at themselves and like itching and like always fidgety, and they can't sit still. So I was super confused because it seemed like stimulants should make ADHD worse, right? Don't we want to like slow people with ADHD down? So this is what's really fascinating about stimulants, and why we use the ones that we use is because what they actually stimulate is activity in the frontal lobes. So the way that stimulants work in ADHD is our brain has a gas pedal and it has a brake. And what the stimulants actually stimulate is the brake. So they actually act in the frontal lobes and then allow the frontal lobes to strengthen the frontal lobes to inhibit other parts of our brain. So what we're actually stimulating is our inhibitory circuitry. As we stimulate our inhibitory circuitry, the ability for our mind to wander reduces, our impulsivity reduces, even some of our psychomotor activity, like the fidgetiness, will actually go down. So what we're actually stimulating is our brakes or our inhibitory circuitry. Next one is ADHD a disability? Great question. So let's start by understanding what a disability is. Generally speaking, the definition that I like to use for a disability is something that makes your ability to participate in life unequitable. So if we think about disabilities, it's not that this person is good or bad, or that they have more value or less value. It's that life is structured in a particular way that assumes that human beings have a particular ability to do things. So a simple example is blindness, right? So our society is structured in a way that relies on sight as being able to function, right? So we'll have road signs, for example. We have cars, we have traffic lights, we have signs that show what's for sale and what isn't. So we have all of these visual dependent things that our society kind of functions on. And if you can't see, then suddenly you're at a huge disadvantage in participating in life because of the way that society is structured. Is ADHD a disability? I'd say it can be. So for some people, their ADHD is so severe that some of the assumptions that we have in terms of how life happens, people with ADHD are not really able to participate in. And there are a lot of simple examples of this. Like one is that, people showing up on time. So in general, our society is designed with things like appointments, where you show up at a particular time and like you assume that everyone else shows up at a particular time. Our society is built with things like deadlines, right? So there's a lot of like time-related stuff that is baked into our society, which people with ADHD really, really, really struggle with. Now, even if it's a disability, that doesn't mean that it isn't fixable. So we know, for example, that even if people are blind, we have like sort of some audio accessibility options. I don't know that you can drive yet, but maybe you'll be able to. You can certainly walk with a stick. We have like crosswalks that will sort of tell you verbally. They'll use sound instead of just light to let you know that it's safe to cross. So we can start to make accommodations, and you can make those kinds of accommodations as well. We cover a lot of this stuff, by the way, in Dr. K's Guide to ADHD and Doing Stuff, about how you can sort of use organizational tools, prioritization techniques, things like that. A lot of the things that people with ADHD really struggle with, we'll sort of teach you how to do that. And what we've actually found, even if you look at cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD, a lot of CBT is sort of like a how to organize and prioritize your life 101 kind of stuff. So I think certainly it can sometimes rise to the level of disability because our society doesn't really accommodate people who have struggles to be on time, for example. And at the same time, just like we can have handicap accessible ramps for wheelchairs, there's a lot of stuff that you can do to compensate for that disability and actually function within life. Why is ADHD overdiagnosed? So in my opinion, ADHD is both the most overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed illness. So why is it overdiagnosed? So the first thing is that remember that ADHD has an environmental component to it. So student-teacher ratios will determine the amount of ADHD that gets diagnosed. So there are some situations in which we'll diagnose it and other situations in which the person actually won't get diagnosed. So why are we overdiagnosing ADHD? A couple of reasons. One is that a lot of the symptoms of ADHD are very relatable. So if we look at, I have difficulty concentrating, I can't sit still, I sometimes forget things, I have difficulty staying organized. The symptoms of ADHD are so much of a universal experience that a lot of people will think that they have ADHD, because who doesn't have difficulty concentrating? I can't sit still in a class for 8 hours and have my mind wander. So since there are so many symptoms which are actually within the normal range of human experience, a lot of people will think that they have ADHD. The second reason that it gets diagnosed a lot is because if you get diagnosed with ADHD and you don't actually have ADHD, it oftentimes works out in your advantage. So if I'm a college student and I want to do well in my classes and I have difficulty focusing, and even if I don't have ADHD, if I can get diagnosed with ADHD and get prescribed a stimulant, it will actually make my college life in some ways easier. It'll be easier to study. It'll be easier to get good grades. So part of the reason that I see a lot of people push for a diagnosis is because in some ways getting diagnosed with ADHD, especially if you don't have it, can lead to advantages. So I think the number one reason we miss diagnoses of ADHD is in the case of a high IQ. So most of the adults that I've diagnosed with ADHD actually have very high IQ. And how do those two things relate? Well, generally speaking, the smarter the child is, the more they can compensate for the shortcomings of ADHD. So they develop all of these adaptations or compensation mechanisms that allow them to essentially continue to get good grades. So it's not that I can actually study, but I'm just so friggin' smart that I don't need to study. So sometimes the diagnosis of ADHD stays incredibly silent as people come up with compensatory mechanisms, and IQ is at the top of the list. Is ADHD curable? Okay, so I'm going to say that the answer is yes and no. We don't think about psychiatric diagnoses as curable. So we think about curable diagnoses as things that can be permanently fixed, right? So an infection is a good example of an external thing that invades your body and can be sort of like altered. There may be other sources of things that can be, let's say, curable. Like, let's say I do bypass surgery for my heart. I have a clogged artery. I literally attach a new artery. That artery is open, fixes the blood flow, essentially cures the problem. The problem with psychiatric illnesses is that we can't go in and like stick something into your brain that'll fix it. And furthermore, the psychiatric illnesses that we have, especially things like ADHD, have to do with the function of our frontal lobes, right? So it's not like an illness that we can fix. It's the way that our neurons are wired. So on the one hand, it would kind of imply that psychiatric illnesses are not curable. On the flip side, what we do know is that with effective treatment, it's essentially as if you no longer have ADHD. So let's go through a couple of things that can quote unquote cure ADHD. The first is that frontal lobes develop until you're about the age of 30 or 32. And we do know that somewhere between 10 and 25% of people will quote unquote grow out of ADHD. And what does that mean? So ADHD is a disorder of basically our frontal lobes. And so as our frontal lobes continue to mature, some of us are kind of right on the cusp where the ADHD is mild enough that frontal lobe maturation basically gets us to cross the line. And then we can essentially live normal lives. But remember, that number is pretty small. It's like basically 10 to 25%. So the next really interesting thing is that if you look at psychotherapy for ADHD versus medication for ADHD, what you tend to find is that if you start someone on medication or psychotherapy, that the outcomes are about the same. So they both help about the same amount. The interesting thing is that within 6 months of stopping medication, the symptoms of ADHD will usually return to baseline. But in the case of psychotherapy, and this is what's really interesting, it takes about 2 years for the symptoms to start to return, Which begs the question, if there isn't a stimulant in my mind that kind of gets washed out of my system, what on earth, why doesn't the ADHD come back within 1 year? Shouldn't it come back kind of right away? And that's where if we really look at the mechanisms of psychotherapy for ADHD, a lot of that stuff is kind of like cognitive training or almost neuronal training, or teaching particular skills that compensate for the ADHD, like how to develop a to-do list, how to stay organized, how to set alarms and reminders. And the cool thing is that if we can start to implement some of those things, it essentially removes the ADHD from the equation. Personally, clinically, I've worked with a lot of people who essentially have sustained remission in ADHD. Like they've been 2 years out from treatment and are actually doing like totally fine. Sometimes I'll get a Christmas card from them, or they'll call me around the holidays and they'll be like, hey, Dr. K, like just wanted to let you know, Merry Christmas. I'll be like, how are you? Or your symptoms back? They're like, no, actually, I'm totally fine. There do seem to be cases where people can kind of like grow out of it or have a sustainable solution that kind of works for them. So even though we don't really know whether ADHD can be curable or not, what we do know is that there are definitely things that you can implement in your life that will basically cancel it out. The last thing is that we also know that there are ways to strengthen the frontal lobes. So meditation is a good example of something that strengthens the frontal lobes that has more of a, let's say, permanent effect. So if you meditate for a long period of time, your frontal lobes will strengthen. If you continue to meditate every day, they'll be kind of generally stronger, but there's some amount of almost permanent effect from it. So there are, I would say, permanent gains to be made with ADHD treatment, even if we can't quite call it a cure. How can you prevent ADHD? What a fascinating question. So what I'm going to do now is actually depart a little bit from science. So it is my belief that if you isolate the different problems that ADHD has, like if you look at the neuroscience deficiencies, let's say impulsivity, let's say the inability to do delayed gratification. It is my belief, and I'm running a trial of sorts on this as we speak, that you can actually teach a child particular skills that will compensate for their neuroscience deficiencies. And I'll give you all just a simple example. So one example is that people with ADHD have difficulty delaying gratification, okay? So what that sort of means is that like, there's a very famous kind of a test called the marshmallow test, where you can offer a child 1 marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows in 5 or 10 minutes. It's the simple idea that if I make a sacrifice today, I can get more tomorrow that people with ADHD really struggle with. So normal kids will be able to wait 5 minutes, 10 minutes. That also has to do to some degree with your personality structure, your degree of conscientiousness. But ADHD kids are notorious at getting instant gratification and being vulnerable to instant gratification. So I was playing a game with someone that I care about deeply recently, and I was playing this game with them intentionally. And the game is this card game called Jaipur. And it's a really lovely board game. And a key part of the board game, it's a trading game where you accumulate cards. But the key thing is that the more cards you sell, the more items you sell at one time, you get like stackable bonuses. So you get sort of like an multiplier on the points that you score depending on, how long you wait to sell stuff. So if I sell 1 of an item, I'll get 1.0. If I sell 2 of an item, I'll get 1.0. If I sell 3 of an item, I'll get 1.2. If I sell 4 of an item, I'll get 1.4. And if I sell 5 of an item, I'll get 1.6 or 1.8. So it's my belief that this game actually trains the brain to learn the skill of delayed gratification. That as I was working with this one particular person, I started playing the game with them, and then originally they would see like a shiny gem and they'd sell it right away because they wanted the points. And over the course of teaching them this game, what we've actually learned is that they've started to delay their gratification some. And not only have they delayed their gratification within the game, I've noticed a change in terms of their ability to delay gratification in other parts of their life. So I am starting to really believe that what you can really do is understand all of the neuroscience deficits of ADHD and start to actually target and train those specific skills. So if you've got a kid who's kind of on that ADHD path, and you take some of these principles from like CBT of ADHD and actually start to teach them to the child, teach the child to meditate, teach the child to be less impulsive. You can potentially train some of those skills. Now, is this scientifically valid? Not really. But this is something that I'm really starting to believe is possible based on this one experiment that I happen to be running. Okay, last question is, how can ADHD affect your performance in school? The short answer is that ADHD can really mess with your school performance. And, I don't know how to say this, but basically school is not designed for the ADHD brain. School is designed for the neurotypical brain. So school is designed under a couple of assumptions. One is that students have a certain level of organization. Second is that students have a certain amount of ability to prioritize. Students have a certain amount of impulse control. So I'll give you all a simple example. So let's look at the last thing is schools have a certain amount of attentional assumptions on the part of their students. So let's tunnel down into that for a second. If you think about school has two ways that we learn, right? You sit in a class and the teacher talks to you. Way number one. Second thing is homework. And the idea is that homework is a reinforcement of what you learned in school, right? So there's this assumption that we teach things in class and those things get reinforced and solidified through homework. Now that school system is designed on the assumption that when there is a teacher in class who is teaching for 50 minutes, that the student will learn something. Obviously, right? That's why we have classes. But imagine what happens if, for example, you're a student in that class. Let's say you're doing a Zoom lecture and your internet connection goes out. Let's say every 5 minutes, your internet connection disappears for 5 minutes. So you only get 50% of what the teacher teaches. Now, what kind of disadvantage do you think that person would have? Because the disadvantage that they face is greater than just what they missed, right? Because now when they get assigned homework, they actually have to teach themselves all of the gaps. So whereas homework may take 1 hour for a regular student, for the kid with ADHD, not only do they have to go and make up, let's say, the 30 minutes of class that they missed out on, but they have to do some amount of catch-up learning, an additional 30 minutes to 1 hour to complete the 1 hour of homework. So whereas one student can accomplish something within 2 hours, 1 hour of class and 1 hour of homework, the kid with ADHD has to have 1 hour of homework, 1 hour, half an hour of patching up class, and an additional half an hour of sort of fixing everything so that they can do the homework. So the ADHD kid, it costs them 3 hours instead of 2. And we're not even considering for a moment that the ADHD kid's mind is wandering while they're doing homework, which is also the case. So now when you really think about it, what takes 2 hours for a neurotypical kid will take 4 hours for an ADHD kid. And why is that? It's because the ADHD mind wanders so much in class that half of the class is wasted on them. So I think we oftentimes don't really acknowledge or realize how devastating ADHD can be for a child. What it essentially means is that you can't participate in school the way that school is designed. And so what ADHD kids have to do is work twice as hard or come up with all of these compensatory mechanisms to try to fix what they're missing from school. And what's so devastating about this, and there's so much research, that if you look at kids with ADHD, there's a 70% chance that they will develop depression later in life, a mood disorder. And that's absolutely a causative effect. So 3% of kids who have major depressive disorder will grow up to have ADHD. But 70% of kids who have ADHD will grow up to have major depressive disorder. And why is that? It's because life is designed for a neurotypical kid. And when you go through life as a neuroatypical kid and you don't even know you're neuroatypical, all you end up with is, man, I am so incompetent. What is wrong with me? How are these kids able to do this? I know I'm just as smart as them, but these kids are getting A's and I'm struggling with C's. Why does it take them 1 hour to do homework and it takes me 3 hours to do homework? And outside of an answer or an explanation that is given to those kids, they internalize it as shame, right? Because if no one explains it to me, what's the most natural conclusion? I'm an idiot. I'm incompetent. I'm lazy. I'm undisciplined. As they internalize those things, it actually manifests as depression later in life. It's so hard.